Hello, I'm ready for chapter 5. Hope you are. It's called The Search Begins. And of course, this is chapter 5 with the diamond in the window. Let me get it all set up here. Okay, so it was a glorious morning. Eleanor leaned on the kitchen windowsill. She saw Mr. LaRue coming along the street, a trash barrel wallowing in front of him. Mr. LaRue was a carpenter and a handyman. The cool morning breeze, remarkable for the first day of July, was stirring the stately branches of Concord's lofty elms. Along Walden Street, the elms stood like tall vases in which someone had arranged long leafy fronds of leaves. Eleanor felt euphoric. "Oh, beautiful elm trees," she said. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies. Oh, beautiful Mr. LaRue. Oh, beautiful whiskers of Mr. LaRue." The rosy morning light was shining on Mr. LaRue's good-humored old face and lighting up his resplendent handlebar mustache. He walked bow-legged and turned up the path that led to the barn, trundling his empty barrel. Uncle Freddie was already out. He was supposed to be weeding the vegetable patch, but when he saw Mr. LaRue coming, he started to frisk about. Mr. LaRue was used to Uncle Freddie. He stopped politely and lifted his hat. Then he turned his barrel upside down and sat on it. Eleanor ran out of doors and leaned her elbows on the silver gazing globe. "Tell me, Mr. LaRue," said Uncle Freddie, "what is written on the wind?" He cocked his head up and put his hand behind his ear as though he were listening to the breeze. Mr. LaRue listened too, then hunched his shoulders. He didn't know. "Henry knows," said Uncle Freddie, "and so does Waldo." He jumped up on a tree stump and pointed his finger fiercely at Mr. LaRue. "Oh, mortal," he said, "thy ears are stones." Mr. LaRue looked worried and pulled at his big ears. They felt the same as ever, and he looked relieved, but Uncle Freddie still glared at him accusingly. "Oh, Mr. LaRue, call not nature dumb," recited Uncle Freddie. "These winds and stones are audible to me, the wind that rustles down the well-known forest road. It hath a sound more eloquent than speech." Uncle Freddie jumped off the stump and made a lunge at the vegetable garden. He pulled lustily at a carrot top, and when it came up too suddenly, he rolled over backwards. Mr. LaRue set him gently back on his feet. Uncle Freddie was waving the muddy carrot in front of his eyes. It was a funny one, with 2 orange legs, like a man. "Brother," cried Uncle Freddie. "Kinsman," he was talking to the carrot. Eleanor giggled. Then he introduced the carrot to Mr. LaRue, who tipped his hat again and shuffled politely. "Immense unity," groaned Uncle Freddie. Then he put his arm around Mr. LaRue and dangled the carrot in front of him, discussing it as if he were telling Mr. LaRue about their new mutual friend. "We are all made of one hidden stuff, Mr. LaRue. What is a tree but a rooted man? The elm tree thinks the same as me. So does my friend and brother here." Uncle Freddie took a huge muddy bite out of the carrot and then stuck what was left of it in his frayed lapel and smiled triumphantly. Mr. LaRue picked up his ash can and rolled it noisily away. He enjoyed listening to Uncle Freddie. It gave him a kind of mysterious good feeling, like church, only out of doors in the sunlight. Eleanor ran to look for Eddie. Today, they were determined to find at least 1 or 2 of the hidden jewels, even if it was just 1 or 2 pearls and a small ruby. She found him at work in the tower room. He was copying the mystic verses into his notebook, squinting at them and writing carefully with his tongue between his teeth. He finished, and together they looked over what he had written. Then they spent the rest of the day searching for clues. First, they cudgeled their brains, that means worked really hard trying to think, over the harp that plays angelic chords. Eleanor could see it clearly in her mind. It would be a great gold curved one with 1,000 strings. They would be very valuable. I know that, she said, but they couldn't think of where to look. For a while they wandered vaguely around the attic, but there weren't any boxes or trunks that were nearly big enough to contain such a gigantic musical instrument. So they gave up on that for the moment, and then they looked further down the list of treasures. Eleanor's attention fastened on the doll. Fit for a princess. How lovely it would be. Surely it would have golden hair and beautiful silken dresses. Perhaps it would look like a princess itself. She went off on an expedition of her own, groping through Aunt Lily's trunks, making a mess of the linens and the winter clothing. But she came away empty-handed, smelling faintly of mothballs. Edward, too, had been unsuccessful. He had been unable to find the mirror that hid a treasure. Starting with the mirror in the tower room, he had pushed up and down and sideways on moldings in a search for secret hiding places. He had shoved big mirror-top dressers away from the walls to look behind them, and he stood on his head in front of them to look at himself upside down. Short of prying the wooden backs off of them to see if $1,000 bills were hidden under the silvered glass, he didn't know anything else to do. Some of the verses were so puzzling they didn't know where to begin. How could they learn to fly in order to bring down the diamonds in the sky? The treasure rounded by the sea lay somewhere deep and dark. Where was that? And who and where was the Bride of Snow? Then Eleanor had a bright idea about the last verse. Eye of bird, eye of fowl, hides the treasure chest. What about Percival? He was a bird, he was a fowl. She went straight to the peacock on the stair landing and looked carefully at his eyes. They were small, hard black beads. Maybe one was a button, and if you pressed it, the peacock would open its mouth and jewels would pour out. She tried. Nothing happened. She tried pressing, twisting, and squeezing both eyes at once. Then she got a knitting needle and gouged his eyes out altogether, apologizing under her breath to Percival all the while. They came out easily enough. Underneath each of them was just a hollow socket into which it had fitted, a socket lined with dried glue. Eleanor pushed her finger hard on the insides of the sockets. Nothing happened. Then she tipped Percival over and sat down on the step with his head in her lap. Carefully and ruthlessly, she cut the stitches along the top of his head with her sewing scissors and pulled his poor moth-eaten skin back. The inside of his head was just a wooden knob covered with cotton padding. Eleanor took the padded knob out, shook it, squeezed it, and then hurriedly stuffed it back in and sewed up Percival's head again as carefully as she could. Then she glued his eyes back in with paste and stood back to look at him. Was he all right again? There was something a little staring and cross-eyed about him now. "I'm sorry, Percival," mumbled Eleanor, and went off feeling guilty and hoping that Aunt Lily wouldn't notice. Meanwhile, Edward had the third treasure all figured out. There must be a chest of jewels like a pirate chest at the bottom of Walden Pond. They would have to hire a rowboat and explore the bottom with a huge net or a long hook. He had heard a rumor that the middle of Walden Pond was bottomless. In that case, perhaps they could hire a diver. Of course, Trevor Nosembore was the sort of fellow who would go down into the fathomless depths himself. But even Trevor would have to have a diving suit. Perhaps they should find some of the other jewels first, and then use the money from them to invest in a boat and the diving gear. But where were the other jewels? By supper time, Edward and Eleanor were thoroughly discouraged. The game didn't seem so much fun at all. The clues were too hard. Perhaps Ned and Nora had been given a second set of clues to help them, or maybe they were just smarter. After supper, their gloom increased. Aunt Lily had taken on a whole new set of evening piano pupils, and from now on, Edward and Eleanor were going to have to wash the supper dishes all by themselves. They were slow about it the first time. When the last pot was put to soak, Eleanor went to the parlor curtain and peeked through. Timothy Shaw was taking a lesson. Timothy was a member of Aunt Lily's church choir. He had a very good tenor voice, but he wasn't really interested in playing the piano. He had started taking lessons because he was sweet on Aunt Lily. He was fumbling and bumbling badly. Aunt Lily was severe. Timothy was abject. At last he went home, after lingering for a long time in the doorway and then almost falling down the front steps saying goodbye. Aunt Lily came into the kitchen and leaned wearily against the sink. "Oh dear," she said. Terrible words rose from the cellar. Eddie was drawn there, having a last look around for clues. Aunt Lily called down the stairs. "What did you say?" Eddie answered in an angry roar. "I said, I swear." "That's what I thought," said Aunt Lily. "Whatever is the matter?" "I dropped a toolbox on my toe," bellowed Eddie. Aunt Lily dealt with the wounded toe. Eddie was sore. Eleanor was glum. Aunt Lily was pale and tired. "I don't suppose," said Eleanor suddenly, "that you would let us sleep in the tower room?" Aunt Lily put her hand to her head and tried to think about it. Why not, after all? The thing that had happened there was very long ago. "Well, go ahead," she said. Delighted, Edward and Eleanor decided to go to bed right away. They put on their pajamas hurriedly and climbed the attic stairs and the ladder steps. They jumped into the small beds. Excitedly, they leaned on their elbows and looked out of the window. It was thrilling to be up so high in their own secret place. The street lights far below shone around the edges of the huge leafy elm trees. The breeze that had freshened the morning was still playing with the smaller branches, lifting them gently and letting them go again. Away across the mill brook, there were window lights. "You can see Emerson's house from here," said Edward. "His ghost is walking," said Eleanor. "It's just the caretaker," said Edward. Eleanor, drifting off to sleep, found herself first thinking about something that Uncle Freddie had said when he was talking to Mr. LaRue. "The elm tree thinks the same as me." What did that mean? She had a funny picture of old Ralph Waldo Emerson standing in his front yard talking on a crank-up telephone that was attached to the trunk of an elm tree, and the elm tree was talking back to him and nodding its head and agreeing. And into the room the diamond shed its own fauceted light, gathered from the street lights and the starlight and the windows of the Emersons' old house. Softly, the light shone over the two children in the bed, and over the possessions of Ned and Nora, and over the slumbering faces of Eleanor and Edward. Something's gonna happen. I'm warning you.